What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at some high-level combat for Dragon Age the Veilguard, brought to us recently by BioWare themselves. For the most part, for whatever reason, they gave early mage gameplay via an NVIDIA trailer, which I thought was an odd choice, to be honest, but it is what it is. Nonetheless, as Gamescom was going on last week, BioWare was releasing parts of their combat overview as well as PC gameplay details. Now, I was interested in this primarily because I wanted to see how the combat played out when you were sufficiently leveled up, and I was hoping they were going to show some proper mage gameplay with this, but unfortunately with that little trailer that they showed, which didn't even have the UI attached to it, we really don't know all of that much outside of some basic attacks. Nonetheless though, with this sort of deep dive into various combat systems, we have a whole bunch of details that I thought were worth going over and speaking about. Now right away, they kicked this off by showing off things like the UI and some of the basics. In our character menu screens, we're going to have access to, of course, our equipment, our abilities, our ultimate ability, as well as runes. Now, abilities are pretty straightforward. You get 3 of these at a base and then an ultimate ability. Now, all of these skills are going to be picked up by your choices in the skill tree. They've said they're going to deep dive progression systems at another time. For here, I think it's just important to know that there are a variety of different potential skills based on what direction you take the skill tree in. And even in this gameplay video, they showed off warrior gameplay specifically and some of the different ways that could play out with a more defensive approach versus a build focused on setting everything on fire, even as a warrior. Now, most of that is pretty well expected from what they've shown previously, but then we have the runes. It would also seem that we are going to be able to slot potentially up to 3 runes, from what I can see here anyway, that augment our abilities in various ways, specifically an active and a passive way, which I imagine will simply augment your overall ability. Though coincidentally, I will say that if you look closely, all of those runes seem to be attached to that crystal knife looking thing that appears in all the key art, which makes me feel like that might be important in some way. But then we have the actual equipment. Now, a few things right away. It looks like weapons are primarily divided up into the damage they deal, of course, and then the stagger they inflict on enemies. We'll talk more about stagger in just a minute. Now, from the abilities associated with these weapons and armor, we notice that there are not a lot of stats associated with them outside of attack and defense. Everything else seems to be purely about damage modifiers or ability modifiers and the like. Everything on them seems to be more like effects rather than stats, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially for their more action-oriented approach that they want to take here. Now, they did talk a little bit about gear for companions in particular, and this is interesting because they get equipment that gets buffs and stuff based on, say, what you have them attacking, for instance, and we'll talk more about controlling companions in just a moment. But it looks like they're going to get gear that can be set up to actually complement what your character is trying to do. Next up, they showed a little bit of our character select screen, presumably when we're about to head off on a mission, as we know this is mission-based, and you'll pick 2 and then be able to customize their abilities and everything as you go. Now, from there, they get into the actual combat gameplay. The first thing they mention is pretty standard stuff. Various enemies will be weak or resistant to certain types of damage, and as an example for this, they explain that Darkspawn in particular will be weak to fire, whereas they are resistant to things like necrosis. But this is also a good opportunity to take a look at the ability wheel in a little more detail. So, as expected, each of our individual characters here has 3 different abilities that they can activate, and then our character gets their ultimate. But we have a little bit more information here because the UI will explain what abilities are going to be able to exploit a weakness by being highlighted in green. This screen is also going to prompt you to look at things like combo opportunities, which comes down to primers and detonators, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other thing I want to draw your attention to, though, is right at the top of the ability wheel here, when we've got things paused, we can see that we can select each of our companions and target enemies with them and have them attack specific enemies as well. So in addition to their actual abilities, it does look like we'll be able to properly control them in combat as well, which I wanted to highlight because honestly, that's just a little more control over them than I thought we were going to get. But the other part of that is, at least in this preview, it seems like the main thing damage-wise for your companions is their abilities in particular. However, when they were showing off the abilities and stuff for the companions in the menu screen, we see that attack and defense stat. And you can see there that the companion's attack seems to be a lot lower than our main characters, and it's hard to tell if that's like by design or if they just wanted to highlight Rook specifically in this showcase. Now, outside of just the abilities we also have a variety of different things we can do in combat just in general. So parries, blocks, counterattacks, all of that kind of thing, and even some like basic weapon swings and stuff is not really associated with your abilities so much as timing and approaching things properly. But we also have the enemies to look at. Some enemies are going to have a extra health bar of some form. One example they gave here was just enemies that have extra armor, which shows up as a yellow bar you have to chew through before you can do the rest of it. And another thing they showed off was the stagger mechanic. So this is another stat associated with weapons, and the more damage you deal to individual enemies, you can fill up a purple bar above their health, which is their stagger meter. When this is full, you can perform a takedown or a finisher to add some flair to what you're doing, but also to get rid of the enemy immediately. But even if you don't do the takedown, they apparently take increased damage in that form as well. Now, the other big thing here, though, is things like the primers, detonators, and ultimate abilities. Now, this is very familiar to you if you've played BioWare's other works. I think the Mass Effect series uses this system a lot with the primers and the detonators, but technically even Inquisition used it a bit. Basically, some abilities will prime an enemy, and then a follow-up with a secondary ability will cause a combination effect of some sort, which is your detonator. And that combo, naturally, deals increased damage and usually also has other effects as well. And that, combined with actually giving your companion some direction mid-combat, I think is about what we can expect in terms of like tactical gameplay in this one. And when you put all of that together, I would say that you pretty much have what the devs were aiming for here, which is an action-oriented combat system that still allows you to control companions to a degree that they've been building to over the course of many of their releases. Speaking for myself, I think it's a shame to limit some of your abilities to such a low number, so even in something like Andromeda, which had a very similar combat system in terms of like your abilities and primers and stuff, and one of my complaints there was just that the low amount of abilities kind of limited what you could do with that combo system they had set up. So even something like giving each character 5 abilities, I think would just go a much longer way, even with this more action-oriented system that they're aiming for. So it looks like that'll probably be a similar complaint I wind up having with this one, though obviously until I play it for myself, it's hard to say for sure. Another thing though, and this is more just curiosity on my part about the rest of the game, because obviously this is a combat showcase and that's where all of their focus was. But we know that this is a mission-based system, and the action combat plays a huge role in that. So I guess my questions now are, what are the actual like story side of things? Are we exploring any? Is there meaningful interaction with the environment or like side quests and stuff to do that are framed in any other way? Or are the explorable areas simply slightly more open versions of missions, or like alternate paths through a mission as an example? And I'm curious about what they have in mind there and what that looks like, which hopefully is another thing they'll answer as we move forward, because at least as far as the combat is concerned, while the action focus wouldn't have been my personal preference, I will say that for the route they have chosen to go, I think this looks pretty good, at least better than I was expecting, especially in terms of how you can direct companions and the like, and even some of the builds you seem to be able to make with some of the examples they gave looked pretty interesting, and at least in that regard, I'm really not so much concerned about the combat side of it, as opposed to what like the overall structure of this game winds up being. In any event though, I think that's pretty well going to do it for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, found it informative, hopefully learned some things if you hadn't already watched this for yourself. And with the release of this one only a couple of months away, we're bound to get tons of more information coming between now and then. And if you'd like to learn about any of that, certainly do like, comment, subscribe, and stick around for a little while. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.